There we go. So welcome. This morning we're going to be looking at, again, lectionary passages, which is a 3-year cycle of reading through the Bible. And last week we looked at 1 Samuel chapter 3, which was the call of Samuel. And this week we'll be looking at Mark 1, which is the call of Jesus's first disciples. And we're pairing that with another lectionary reading from Paul in 1 Corinthians. So without further ado, we'll get underway. Our questions for discussion. What do you find most rewarding about being a Christian? And what are the most difficult parts of following Jesus from your perspective?
I think for me, the most rewarding is just the church family, the friends that I have that I really call my closest friends are all part of the church. And that's kind of where I grew up, where I still find myself spending time with these group of believers. And probably the most difficult part is trying to follow in Jesus's footsteps as well as he did, knowing that I can never attain that perfection, but even trying with all the outside stuff going on around us, just is sometimes very challenging.
Same for me, actually, and I'm not on video because I have to apologize, but I'm trying to get an appointment for a COVID vaccine, and the line is continuously busy, but I will be trying until I finally get through someday. But the whole church family is, no matter where I go, and I go to the Midwest and all over when I go on vacations and that, and when we go to a church, it's a Reformed church, we always know somebody who's either related, to one side of the family or the other, and the connection is always just so precious.
Carol, I saw that you were going to respond to.
Well, I agree with what Rick said, because the church family, this is kind of missing now, in the sense that we're not getting together except in little cubes. So it's not the same as being there and hugging people and touching people and so forth.
Yeah, I find that one of the most rewarding parts of being a Christian is I find meaning and purpose in the words of scripture and in my church family, but then also what's really difficult about being a Christian is, and how I interpret scripture, is this constant call to die to yourself, this letting go of the old ways, being transformed to this new way. And that's really challenging when it's humbling and there's suffering involved, and loving your enemies. There's just a lot of calls to that new way, and that can be really challenging to let the old ways go.
For me, that the challenge is also, it's relentless. Every once in a while, we just have a nice day with our family and we just spend time together. And then I think, that was a good day. I hope Jesus isn't mad at me for that. We didn't do anything productive for the world today. We didn't do anything to serve the Lord except to just be our family. And, sometimes, sometimes being a follower is just, there comes with a certain sense of guilt, right? But also the idea that our families, our spouses, our children, those kind of things, those connections, we do have our friends. We kind of feel like they're in our lives for a reason too. So maybe being a Christian is promoting or, working on those relationships, even if it doesn't have to do with serving, somebody who's hungry a piece of bread that day. It's just, being with the people who are really important to you because you think maybe God is part of that too. So it's a blessing, but it's also kind of difficult to like wrestle with. And I'm foreshadowing because we're going to talk about a passage that deals exactly with this. This is why I'm bringing this up in 1 Corinthians, because Paul talks about whether it's good to be single or to have a family, what's better. And it's kind of like, yeah, we'll think about that and what that means for us. But certainly those are difficulties, and
Chris,
I wouldn't want to put words in the mouth of my wife, but I'm sure it's not always easy to have professional commitments within your family to a wider Christian church, and that can't be a easy thing all the time. It certainly isn't for me, but I always get the benefit of actually being there for people, not absent at home. So.
But I don't think you can ever minimize the love of family. You know, I had a very unique opportunity Monday when my granddaughter, Faith, your niece, turned 15, and what she wanted to do was be with me. Well, they live in Pennsylvania, and I haven't seen them for over a year, which is really hard. So my son has a plane, and they flew to the Lakewood airport. They brought Sister Jillian with them, and I got to spend an hour walking along the runways of Lakewood airport with my granddaughter and my other granddaughter and my son. And, you know, it's fresh air and amid the pine barrens. So we were socially distanced enough to justify that we were okay. But I've been isolating, and isolating alone for 10 months gets a little challenging, to say the least. So that was a real blessing day for me. And I think we can't ever minimize time we spend loving our family and being with them.
Yeah, we haven't seen our grandkids in Pittsburgh since a year ago Christmas.
Yep.
And just last week they called and said, hey, we're trying to make some plans for the summer. We want to come up and spend a week with you in July. And it's like, you know, that gives me something to look forward to, as much as it's still 7 months away. But it just kind of lifted my heart and my spirits to say, yes, we will see them again. There is that hope of getting families together again.
So thank you for all of your reflection. And we're going to keep holding this intention, especially when we get to Paul in just a minute or two. But for right now, we'll look at Mark, which is probably a somewhat familiar passage to many of us, because it doesn't just happen in Mark. This is a calling of Jesus to his first disciples. So we're going to turn to Mark chapter 1, and we're going to be reading verses 16 through 20 there. Would anybody be willing to volunteer for this reading, verses 16 through 20 of Mark chapter 1?
Sure.
Thank you, Rick.
As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him.
Thank you, Rick. How does Jesus recruit Andrew and Simon, and how about James and John?
He's just walking by and says, hey, come follow me. Seems very simple. Didn't give a lot of pomp and circumstance or what's going on or what's going to happen. But just
join me at a meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder about this passage of, like, you know, we hear it as being really simple, but I also wonder if Jesus had seen them and had been with them in some capacity before actually saying, come and follow me. Like, you know, he might have grown up with these guys.
Right.
and like, oh, these are some people that I could see being good disciples and showing people how to be in the world. But yeah, he just kind of said, yeah, come and follow me. And
in John, we're told that at least Andrew, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't recollect of all of them, but at least Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist, who introduced him to Jesus, and then Andrew introduces Peter / Simon to Jesus too. So there seems to not be this just first connection here. You know, it's almost as if Andrew and Peter are in their boat saying, man, I promise if anybody ever asked me to do anything but this, I would just jump at the chance. This is the worst job ever. Oh, okay, I'll follow you, Jesus. Yeah, that sounds good. You know, you wonder what's their mindset, because if this is the first time they've really encountered Jesus, they're kind of ridiculous for just going along, you know? So we would hope they would have some sort of pre-existing relationship, as has been mentioned, whether it's not that big of an area, right? So like you probably know, at least like Mom was saying, the Reformed Church in general, you attend somebody, we call it Dutch bingo. You can get, you know, within a few degrees of separation, you can figure out whose cousin's married to who's somebody else in South Dakota / Michigan and Iowa, and there you go. But you wonder if they thought, oh yeah, Jesus, that's right, his mom's Mary, that's my mom's cousin's sister-in-law with on that side of the family, you know. So like everybody kind of would probably know each other a little bit through these villages and towns, but
it was a time of decision for them.
Absolutely, Jenny. So whether they knew a lot about Jesus or a little, this is pretty, you know, this is a big change. This is a new step for them. Absolutely, a new part of their lives. So what daily concerns would they have to consider as they went along to follow Jesus? What are some of the things they need to still worry about?
Food.
It's great to say, yeah, I'm following Jesus now. What are some things you'd still be concerned about?
They have to worry about food, basically, is one.
Shelter, where are you going to stay? Where are you going to go?
Well, I mean, it says he left his father. So, you know, commitments to your family and what you're leaving behind sort of jumps out at me.
And the family business, it's not just the family, it's the family business. You know, it's all like, oh, yeah, there's a lot there, right?
Yeah, because I think of like the fish nets, those would have been passed down from generation to generation. And so I think of like you're leaving behind something that your father's father's father like started, and that's just like a total shift in perspective, probably in that culture and probably in this culture too.
Yeah, and your brothers are still fishermen. Chris, how many of the early disciples were married, just for family reference here, with those people who followed him?
So we don't know.
Oh, come on. You have to have an answer.
Yeah. We know Paul was married. We know Peter was married. You know, the Da Vinci Code would tell us Jesus was married, but that's you know, that's one of those things we dealt with 15 years ago when it was a popular novel. But I'm not going to go there. I'm going to say though that Paul and Peter were definitely married. We know that for sure because Peter has a mother-in-law, and Paul talks about marriage too, which we'll get to as well. Although interestingly, he never talks about his marriage. Probably a good thing. I'm sure that keeps the peace at home.
There's probably got to be a few disciples who are married. Like I'm thinking like Bartholomew. He's not really mentioned that much, so it's like
he must have been. He probably had a lot of kids. He had to take
probably
care
with a lot of kids. Kids, you know.
Yeah, we talk about Bart more, but he's always got a thing. He you know, another thing came up. You know, yeah. So I would think that there doesn't seem to me to be instances of, it would have been very uncommon for disciples to go through marriageable age of that time and not be married. So I think it would have stood out, and I think we would have known about it. So my feeling is that it's probably safe to assume that almost all, if not all, of his disciples were married. The only exception, I just from kind of feel, is John, the beloved disciple. Just because John starts in the community at an early age, and he's exiled at a late age, and it doesn't seem like there's any time in between he ever is connected to any family except for Jesus's family being married. There's a time where we think that Mary went to be with John, to live with John in Ephesus, but yeah, I would say most of the disciples seem like they're definitely married and part of family groups.
Most of the ministry was done like within a distance, like the capital region here, wouldn't it be? Around Galilee and like that.
Yeah, right, Jenny. So they're following him. They're not necessarily at home, but they tend to be close to home.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They have a home base right nearby.
Yeah, that region of Galilee it's not a huge, and when we're talking about all of Israel, we're talking about 150 miles north to south, which is a long way to travel on foot. But let's just remember that, we're not talking about, all over the place. We're talking about it. And as you say, Jesus, it's very specific when he travels as far down to Jerusalem, let alone, anywhere else. So he tends to stay in that region. You're right, Jenny. He tends, and I like Rick's reading. We usually call it the Sea of Galilee, but lake is probably a better term. It's not much of a sea. It's not a huge body of water. I think the name is Lake Gennesaret or something. I have to look at the name, but the Sea of Galilee is also known as a lake in very common language. So they'd still have a lot of concerns. They'd have to think about how they're going to feed themselves. I mean, they're no longer fishermen. They'd have to think about where they're going to stay if they're not going to be at home, even though they're close to home. Are they going to be able to stay with other people? Or what does that mean? Traveling around now? And then there's some things that they would just have to give up. Like Marcy, you said, they had nets that they would have inherited. That's part of the family business. And they would have had to kind of turn their backs on that, right? So in some sense, maybe their father endorses what they're doing, but in some sense, they kind of have to say, well, we can't worry about dad's business anymore. We've got to let that be. And maybe we'll help when we come back, but we can only help when we get there. We can't always be worried about that. So why do you think they went with Jesus? Pure speculation. We have no clues in the text.
They had a feeling in their heart that this was going to be an important decision for their lives and others, I think.
Scale of 1 to 10, 1, no idea, 10, fully knowing. What number do you think they have any idea of what they're getting into? 1, no idea, 10, they have a good idea, fully know what they're getting into. 4?
Solid 4. Yeah,
4.
I was just
4.
thinking like a
like not really.
So but like, this is a big step. So at least like a 3 or 4, right? Like we know this is something different, but like not a 10. Like we have no idea. We're going to be like, oh man, we better like these other 11 guys. We're going to be hanging out with them a lot for the next 3 years, right?
Yeah, they didn't even know how long it was going to be.
That's right, Rick.
We know
in hindsight, right? Yeah.
They do. They had no clue.
And they weren't so stupid as to all of a sudden say, there's nothing about that man that would intrigue me to go with him. He was an intriguing, honest figure who was saying things that were, they really couldn't say no to try and find out more, it seems to me. Curiosity.
A year into it, I would agree with you. At this point, we have no record of him being anything but a carpenter. And, you know, if you're a follower of John the Baptist, because you're intrigued by camel hair and locust eating, then fine. Then John says that's the guy. You say, all right, that's the guy. I go follow him. But if you don't know of John the Baptist and you're just hanging out and all of a sudden you're like, well, this guy, I don't know, that's Joseph's son. I don't know what he's doing. He should be back home making tables. I'm not really sure what he's talking about, going fishing. He doesn't know anything about fishing. So certainly once you start hearing him talk, there's a lot to be intrigued about. But I wonder if these, you know, was there a sermon by the lakeside that we missed that he preached and then these guys decided to follow him? Like that would have been a great thing to have recorded, but all we get is you don't have to fish for fish anymore. You can fish for people, which sounds a little weird, but okay, I'm in, you know, we don't know.
And it almost
like, oh, go ahead, Rick.
I was going to say, it almost gives the impression that they're strangers, that, you know, Ginny said it's a small area, but they might have been complete strangers. And it's like, why is he calling me to follow him? I have no clue who he is. And my father's right here. I'm supposed to carry on the family business. I'm supposed to work with him. Why do I want to leave my dad and go off with this complete stranger?
Yeah, and he was young compared to some of the others probably. And they probably thought, well, I'm a little too old to do this, or he's a little too young to be doing this.
I mean, 30, we think he's about 30 at the time. 30 is not a young man in that culture at that time. That's, you know.
Couldn't they have been in their teens and 20s?
Probably most of his disciples are younger than he is. But for Jesus to go on this new ministry is like a midlife crisis in that day and age. You know, like you had a valuable skill, you know, you were a tradesman and now you're going and doing this stuff. It's like, yeah. It's a weird thing. So
I tend to be like in the school of thought that because it was such a small area and because of the probability of, and maybe this is me leaning a bit more into Jesus' humanity, is that Jesus knew these people already and we just don't have any record of them, you know, the first interaction, you know, with Peter going to the carpenter, like going and like needing a table or something. Like we don't have that interaction. But
every time I just try and buy a chair, the guy gives me a sermon like, man, enough already. Like, you're a carpenter, stick to what you know, right? So so right, we don't know that. You're right, Marcy. And we do know though from John's gospel that it seems for sure that Andrew was a follower of John the Baptizer. And so there's definitely would have been a connection through that. So, and once you have Andrew, then you have Peter, and then anybody Andrew and Peter know, you would think, you know, Andrew goes down as a very kind of like a side note in the Bible, but in kind of Christian myth or imagination, we think Andrew's the one who introduces everyone to Jesus because he seemed to be the first one on the scene in the Gospel of John. And then all of a sudden, everybody just kind of like, oh yeah, Nathaniel, we've known him since 6th grade. And, you know, there's Philip, we've known him since we used to play in the backyard together. You know, those kind of things. We think that Andrew probably was a connector of people there.
One of the qualifications for discipleship might have been an open mind that hadn't formed too many strong views about Jewish living and so forth. That he could mold, that Jesus could mold.
And we kind of see that problematically later on, Judas is disappointed that he didn't get what he wanted out of Jesus, right? So we think that Judas betrays Jesus in part because he feels maybe that he didn't get what he thought Jesus was supposed to be. So yeah, there is an open-mindedness that's necessary here for new ideas and new thoughts. So speaking of that, we're going to get to Paul. Talking about someone who was closed-minded and had a total conversion. We're going to get to his first letter to the Corinthians, and we're going to turn to chapter 7. We're going to read 25 through 40 there in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, but we'll start just by reading 25 through 31. And I'll take a turn reading here. Paul writes, "Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the impending crisis, it is well for you to remain as you are. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, do not sin, and if a virgin marries, she does not sin. Yet those who marry will experience distress in this life, and I would spare you that. I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. How does Paul introduce what he's about to say in verse 25, and what does this mean?
Come as you are, who you are.
Well, before he gets to his advice, he prefaces it with a word about himself. What does he say about himself?
I have no command from the Lord, but I give judgment as one who is trustworthy.
Jesus never said anything about this, but you can trust what I'm about to say. So that's what he says to start with his comments here. So Paul is trustworthy, but it's interesting to notice that at this point, he prefaces all he's about to say with, just so you know, the Lord never told me any of this. This is just me talking. We never heard Jesus say anything about this. You know, Paul wasn't alive with Jesus anyway, but, you know, this is just me talking. And he's alive at the same time as Jesus. He wasn't a follower of Jesus when Jesus was alive. Let's put it that way. Why is Paul sharing this message? I looked to verse 29 in particular there. What seems to be the atmosphere of what's going on, what the people are thinking in Corinth at the time?
Weren't they kind of thinking that the time of the second coming was imminent, and that at that point in time, you know, like everything's going to be wiped out or something is going to happen?
It seems like their understanding is that the second coming is going to be soon. So Calvin talks about Paul's advice applying to any age of time, but even he admits that it does seem to apply to a people who are expecting the second coming imminently.
Within their lifetimes, yes.
I wonder if some Republicans might be feeling in this way for the next 4 years, just sort of treading water, waiting to see if Trump can come back for them.
A literal second coming of a politician. Yeah. You know, it's interesting that I think I've read so much about American, I'll put in air quotes, theologians talking about how to find out the end times and how you know they're coming over the last, decade or two. And it's interesting that it always has to do with American politicians. Yeah. That the Bible always is talking about American politicians, which is for me, I think, well, wow, we really lucked out. Like, how come the Bible's always all about us, which is pretty incredible, right? So I distrust anybody who speaks to very specific instances, even if they mean a whole lot to us. If they don't mean a whole lot to people all around the world, it seems like it's really hard to think that that would have any divine significance. I mean, like people have been talking, and there's theologians, I'm sure, in Nigeria and in Indonesia and in all over the world who are telling you about the signs of the second coming and pointing to very specific things that are happening in their location and their place.
Well, think about Y2K. What we went through at the turn of the century.
At least Y2K, everybody went through it. That's Y2K was scary because everybody was going through Y2K. Anybody who believed in the calendar that we set, right? But you know, otherwise we have all these localized things, and people make it seems like we give ourselves a sense of self-importance every time we look to one thing occurring in our country and saying, that's it. That's what the Bible's talking about. I'm not saying that that's not the case, you know, and that in those days, Rome mattered a lot, but Rome kind of controlled everything that people were talking about. Rome controlled a lot of different peoples and groups, not just one country. So it's interesting to look at that. But yes, there's a sense of a second coming being imminent in 1 Corinthians. In this community in Corinth, it seemed like they were expecting Jesus to return soon, which a lot of the letters of Paul respond to that kind of feeling, actually. So what's Paul specifically saying, especially in verses 29 to 31?
Put things in perspective.
Put things in perspective? That's a good way to translate it.
Under the idea that the world may be ending soon. Put things under perspective.
So what's truly important? You know, if he talks about buying and selling goods, be like you don't, like you have none. In other words, you know, if that's your business, if that's your livelihood, what's that going to matter when Jesus comes again? What's that going to matter in the future? So put things in perspective. What's truly important right now? So what specifically in this passage does he talk about when it comes to marriage? What's Paul's point about marriage?
If you're married, stay married. If you're not married, don't get married.
Stay as you are kind of thing. Yep. If you're married, fine. You're not a sinner. But if you're not married, you don't need to get married. Unless you can't control yourself, he'll say, then you're allowed to get married. But right now, just, you know, just stay where you are. Don't get entangled in anything right now. It's not a good time, is Paul's kind of general advice here. So we can understand his motivation being the idea of let's kind of think about what's most important in the days to come. Now, for the people of Corinth at that time who expected Jesus' impending return, okay. For those of us who are living 2,000 years later and still anticipating it, maybe just not as immediately, how does this advice still apply to us is kind of what we're going to be wrestling with, right? So would somebody be willing to read verses 32 to 40 for us?
I can read it.
Thank you.
Okay. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried woman and the virgin are anxious about the affairs of the Lord, so that they may be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to put any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards his fiancée, if his passions are strong and so it has to be, let him marry as he wishes. It is no sin. Let them marry. But if someone stands firm in his resolve, being under no necessity but having his own desire under control, and has determined in his own mind to keep her as his fiancée, he will do well. So then, he who marries his fiancée does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if the husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, only in the Lord. But in my judgment, she is more blessed if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God.
So just one note that anytime Ellen read the word fiance, the Greek says virgin. So if anyone thinks he's not behaving properly towards his virgin, if his passions are strong and so it has to be, let him marry as he wishes. There's some confusion with scholarship thinking like, well, is this like the only person who would own a virgin would be the father of the young woman who would give her in marriage? but that can't be what this is talking about. So it must be like a man and a woman who are going to be married but have yet to consummate the marriage. That's why we use the term fiance. We're trying to get to the actual what this is meaning. And so just to clarify that, in case your Bible has different language, we think that what we're saying is if there's a couple who has not yet consummated their marriage and wants to remain kind of spiritually together but not physically together, Paul says do that. That's a good idea. But if you're already past that point, that's fine. But apparently there existed in Corinth and maybe some other traditions this idea of a spiritual marriage where you live as husband and wife, but you don't consummate the marriage. And then there was a physical marriage, which, you know, that was for the losers who couldn't control themselves or something. There seems to be a lot wrapped up in this that we're just not quite sure exactly what Paul is referring to in all of it. But it seems to imply that there's a state of marriage that before the consummation of the marriage in kind of the engagement or betrothal that he's trying to get to. So just so that that language doesn't get in our way as we kind of talk about the passage. So Paul wants us to be free from anxieties. How does he demonstrate the impossibility of this in verses 32 through 35?
I think he's just talking that if somebody's married, then the husband and the wife are concerned about each other as well as things outside their relationship. And if you're not married, then you're concerned about all these other things and not this. And so it's always a kind of a mix. I'm talking with my hands here. It's just kind of a mixed bag of interests pulling you from different directions, trying to get your attention.
So it's interesting. He says, I want you all to be free from anxieties. That's his like opening statement in this part of the passage, right? And then as soon as he says that, he says, if you're not married, you're anxious about what the Lord wants of you. But if you're married, you're anxious about your commitment to your family. It's like, what? Yeah, where's the part where I'm free from anxieties? I didn't get to be free from anxieties no matter what state I'm in, right? So like, as soon as Paul tells you about be free from anxieties and be anxious about what the Lord wants from you, like, oh, that doesn't sound like free from it. Okay, I'll get married. Well, now you be anxious about what your husband or wife wants from you. Like, oh, geez, that doesn't seem like a freedom from anxiety either. So
I wouldn't have wanted to hang out with Paul. I think he would not have been a fun person. I think he would not have, I think he would have been very thinking about himself all the time.
He definitely seems to be one of those people who's always thinking about, you know, the law and theology and how Paul seems like the kind of person who's very sure of what he's saying, although it makes no sense to anybody else half the time. You know, it's kind of like, I'm sure that was a good sermon, but I don't know what he said. Yeah, he does seem not to be, I don't think anybody's ever accused Paul of being jovial. There's very little of that in what we see of Paul. Not that many Bible characters seem jovial, although Jesus seems to be, at some times, have a little bit of a sense of humor in some of the things that are going on. But yeah, Paul, not so much.
The people who knew Jesus, they can speak more authentically than a person who learned about Jesus through the Holy Spirit. That's a debatable thing, or by his own conversion experience. I don't think he has the qualifications by being second distance from, like the disciples were with Jesus and he's sort of second distance from it. I don't think he has the qualifications to be so expressive and broad and explicit with his ideas. He's not with Jesus to get feedback. I mean, we can say the Holy Spirit is equal to being with Jesus, but he is not, does not have the same feedback of the truth of what he's saying as disciples would have with Jesus.
Well, and think about what Jesus does a little bit, well, somewhere along the line here, when he's at the wedding and they run out of wine and it's a party, and he turns the water into wine, and the party continues. It's not, and I know there were social mores to be observed by having enough wine, but he was concerned about the people celebrating this wedding in the tradition that they were expecting to.
So you wonder what Paul would have thought if he was at that wedding.
He would have left. He wouldn't have been invited, I don't think.
That's what I'm getting at.
One in the corner saying, "Why is everybody having so much fun? It's a wedding."
It's a wedding. Yeah.
I think that, Ginny, I hear what you're saying. I do think the Holy Spirit is equal to Jesus in this sense of influence in that and conversion. However, I will say seems to be a difference between the disciples who lived and breathed with Jesus, who experienced humanity with Jesus, versus a guy who knows Jesus is human, but didn't really get to be part of that human touch that Jesus offers so often, right? So maybe there is that. Maybe that's what we sense about Paul, that he knows all about Jesus, but he wasn't there when he healed that person. He wasn't there when the blind man could see, and there's like the people who were surrounding Jesus at that time, they just understood the difference of that human touch that Paul understands in theory, but maybe doesn't communicate as well all the time. Let's just say that. So what's Paul's general advice in verses 36 through 38, and what factors are in play in the decision?
This was like Houghton College's favorite section of scripture. Like, men and women, if you are distracted by your tendencies and temptations, you better just get married immediately and move on with being a married couple, so you're not distracted by, your wayward minds. But really, it's better if you can just douse yourselves in cold water and stay single. Like, that was kind of I think this is like carved into a wall somewhere.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of Christian colleges that have that kind of, I think it comes with the student handbook, right? So yeah, if you find yourself daydreaming about somebody, better just to get married and get it over with. Like, oh, okay.
Showers are popular in colleges.
Yeah, so then you see a lot of like 19 and 20-year-olds getting married after they've been together for a couple months because, well, I'm just following the Bible, and you say, but yeah, so what factors play in the decision? How much cold water do you have? That's kind of the factor here. If you can keep yourself under control, fine. But if you can't, it's all right. You're not sinning. Paul kind of says it's not like a big sin. It's just you're weak. Is kind of the way I read it from Paul, which is funny because we do think Paul is married. So Calvin is like Paul's successor 1,500 years later. Calvin basically, lives apart from his wife and talks about how great it is to follow the Lord all the time. It's like, yeah, easy for you to say, Calvin. You're surrounded by your books, not by your family, So what topic does Paul cover in the last couple verses of this passage? And this one is one that comes up still all the time in our society today.
Well, it talks about a woman being bound to her husband for as long as he lives, though it doesn't necessarily imply the reverse.
Well, I think we should take it to imply the reverse too.
Okay.
Oh,
okay.
But isn't there some verse in the old, I don't know where I heard this, but a man could divorce his wife by turning 3 times in the town center and say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And then they were divorced.
You could just present a certificate of divorce. I don't know if you had to dance while you did it, but you could just divorce somebody. Yeah. But here it says that once a marriage is for life, but once somebody dies, you're allowed to remarry. So there was it seems as if there has been, and there was maybe then, but there has been certainly throughout Christianity, kind of people who look down at widows who have to get married again. Like, you've been married, now it's your time to serve the Lord. Or widowers, you know, men and women. But Paul's saying, no, you made the commitment. That's fine. You can get remarried. Once somebody has died, there's no. Paul's saying that you shouldn't look down at remarriage. So sometimes in some societies that has been the case over the years. Paul is telling us that is not the case. That you can get remarried once you've already done it. You might as well just do it again. You know, if you can't stay single, might as well get married more than once.
Well, wasn't it kind of part of tradition that if a woman's husband passed away, then the husband's brother was supposed to marry the widow?
In the Old Testament, there's levirate marriage sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah, but that had to do more with, you know, that was really the agrarian culture where, like, you needed to provide members for the farm family kind of thing. And, like, you didn't separate out clans once they were joined together. So the only way to keep that joined together is to give the wife another husband from the same family kind of thing.
Okay.
So what does Paul admit in closing again in verse 40?
He's staying single.
Somehow he makes it about himself at the end.
Really, again, and he uses the word judgment. He, you know, it's his way. It's my judgment, in my judgment, my opinion.
He's admitting that Jesus didn't say this again. So it's not that it doesn't matter if Jesus didn't say it. It's not that it doesn't matter if it's not in red letters in your Bible, you know, but Paul is saying this advice is coming from me. So that's important, and it's good self-recognition. Paul definitely has as high an opinion of himself as we do years later. Let's put it that way. He considers himself an authority because of his own experience, not because of what's been invested in him. So we definitely get that. So my last question is Paul's advice fair? How does it make being a follower of Jesus harder? And is there a way to follow his advice without feeling guilty?
No.
I wonder. I don't know that we actually have answers to that. I wonder. That's going to be the focus of the sermon on Sunday. And the question for discussion, and I leave this for you without comment, but feel free to comment if you have one. A wise Christian once told me she lives by the acronym JOY for putting her priorities in place. Jesus, others, and then yourself. Does that work? Sometimes, always, or never? Why or why not?
I have not heard that acronym before, but certainly we have heard time and time again, Jesus should be our number one priority. And in my judgment, to use Paul's words, putting Jesus first allows everything else to fall into place properly behind that.
And I think sometimes it's a matter of perspective. I like to call it picking nits, although nitpicking is a little bit more common way of saying it, right? But
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say sometimes taking care of yourself is a holy thing. Sometimes taking care of others is how we serve Jesus. You know, so like Mother Teresa is known for all of her work with the poorest of the poor and how she helped others all the time. But every Christian says, well, she was following Jesus. But the narrative is that Mother Teresa did what she did. Like, you don't call somebody a Mother Teresa because they're serving Jesus. You do it because they selflessly help others all the time. Right? So, but her priority wasn't Jesus as she helped others, right? So sometimes we see that. Sometimes in our lives we come to a crossroad and we have to do something about ourselves. We have to do something. We have to change ourselves. It's not because we're being selfish and our priorities are out of order. It's because that's how you follow Jesus. And so I I like the acronym. On the other hand, sometimes it confuses us, just like Paul's advice. Get married or don't. Be anxious, but don't. Be free of anxiety as you're anxious about everything.
I had a friend in college who, Gracie Reed, and she's from New Jersey, and there I was in the Midwest, and her favorite phrase was, I'm third, I'm third, I'm third. First God, then others, then me. And you know, people didn't generally go around saying that back then. And I liked that. I thought, you know, she was a fun, balanced kind of person, and it didn't make her a holy roller. It didn't make her pious. She was caring about a lot of people. And I think that was exemplary.
I have heard this acronym before. And at one point I would even say I stood by it. I don't think I necessarily stand by it as strongly as much, because I do think that when you can constantly say I'm third, or like, you know, I'm going to put myself last, I think that is a place of privilege. And I think that there is something about, I don't have to worry about me. I'm just going to worry about other things. I think there is something like, there's like a privilege behind that. And I also think that when we serve others, we're also serving Jesus. We hear Jesus saying, when you clothed the naked, you were clothing me. When you you fed the hungry, when you visited those in prison, like, you were seeing me. And so I think that there is something about this. I like the acronym, but I also think there's some holes in it that can be, I think there's a better acronym out there.
But maybe there's not, but maybe there's different ways to look at that acronym, right? So like, I just leave that as something that some of us have heard before, and it's interesting, and in some ways it rings very true, but in other words, it can be problematic in other ways, right? So just an admission, we're not going to solve that one today, but the idea that if that's an acronym you live by, I bless it, and I don't tell you that's a bad idea. If you say, I can't stand that acronym, I say, yeah, I can understand why you might have some difficulties with it too. So we can understand how that could be very important for some, and have some people could reject it, all coming to the same place ultimately of how to try and live their lives as followers of Jesus. So thanks for joining us as you've been called to be disciples each in your own way. I hope that, the advice you get is a little less confusing than Paul's about being anxious by not being anxious, or whatever, however he puts it. So, and may some moments of life be free from anxiety. We don't get a lot of them, but hopefully there's some of them. So go in peace today. We'll see you again next week for another Bible study.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.